not make me cry, guys.
I know.
Too beautiful.
Thank you, Gary Gygax.
Yeah.
And Dave Arneson, who doesn't get as much credit as he totally deserves. They're great American heroes.
Welcome to Worldcasting, where we discuss real, made-up things. I'm your host, Dino, and today you'll be joining me in a discussion on world building for tabletop settings and managing a shared setting for novelizations. Whether it's a world meant for a D&D campaign or an expansive setting shared with several other creators, we'll discuss how to come up with those settings and how to manage them. Today, joining me are Chris and Rag, and we have a special guest, Phil Athans. He is the former senior managing editor of the Forgotten Realms D&D setting for Wizards of the Coast, and he is starting a world-building course for Writer's Digest. Excited to have you with us today, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
All right, so I think we will just kind of straight up jump into quickly talking about your work, Phil. If you'd like to just give a little recap for everyone, that'd be phenomenal.
To make a long story short, right, I guess I just have lived the science fiction and fantasy lifestyle as long as I can remember, which is a long time now, and just really got into D&D in particular pretty early on in the summer of 1978, right before I started high school. So just, and played it and was just instantly like, this is what I'm doing now, right? This is it for me. And I ended up starting to work at TSR in 1995. So just a little bit less than 2 years before Wizards of the Coast came in and bought up the company and moved us to Seattle. And I was there till 2010, always in the book publishing end of things, but also worked on the, developing the 4th edition, sort of complete redo of the Forgotten Realms.
Oh, you were there through that when they did the time jump?
Yeah, I was kind of, it was myself, Rich Baker, and Bruce Cordell who did all of that development work, which was mostly just sort of waiting for some word of what was coming out of the 4th edition D&D team. And it was almost never anything that was remotely manageable. So it was like, well, that's a complete redo. Let's see, how do we even remotely accommodate that? And then it was like, I think maybe we can try this. Okay, we'll do that. And then another complete rethink would happen like a day later. And, so it was just sort of trying to not even fit a round peg into a square hole, but, I don't know.
Sorry, are there any truth to the rumors that R.A. Salvatore and Ed Greenwood tried like 1,000 different ways to convince Wizards to not do the time jump?
Yeah. It wasn't even, yes and no. No, there was a meeting that we held at Gen Con before really 4th edition was even announced that there was going to be a 4th edition. And it had some of those key people there. Ed Greenwood was definitely there. Bob Salvatore was there. And at that point, we think the only way to do this is a hard reset. That it's going to be everything about the way the world works essentially was changing. And that's the sort of thing that if you're not one of those people who are playing D&D, at least starting in 3rd edition, and then saw 4th edition, you kind of don't really realize it wasn't compatible at all. Like there was no way to just sort of say, I'm going to kind of add feats to my 2nd edition character. And yeah, I can see how this, it's complicated, a little complicated, but I can do it. It was really just a hard reset in terms of everything in the way the world worked, right? We're talking about world building. It was, magic has always worked this way in D&D, and now all of a sudden it works a completely different way. And, not in the sort of, well, I can cast a spell and this is how many spells I get per day and that kind of thing was close to the same. It was where magic comes from, how it manifests, who gets what, and how you get. It wasn't just. There was no way to just say, "Oh, it was kind of always like that." Like, oh, don't. When you read all those old books, just pretend that like the evil planes were only one plane and all the good planes were only one plane, and there was no way to make those two things work together without a complete stop and restart. And there would, in terms of were people sort of arguing against it, to be honest, everyone was arguing against it except some very small group of people. And I can't even tell you, I know for sure that the names of two of them, and that was it, who were in that, part of this, the D&D 4th edition development team. And I don't know where their marching orders were from. I think there was some sense of make this more compatible with, or something, maybe more friendly to video games. That was kind of a rumor that was going around. But mostly it was just, oh, it's going to be really, really different, but it's going to be so cool and great, that everybody's going to like it. So he's like, all right, well, let's go. And all of that, all things being equal, I think in the end, what we had in that 4th edition campaign setting was pretty cool. It was just, for the Forgotten Realms fan, it was just too much all at once. It was
very heavy. I was playing a lot of 3.5 then, and living through that, it was like, well, what is happening to the setting? And it wasn't only until years later that I'm like, you know what, I kind of like this. I should have given it more of a chance.
Right. But that's the thing that I think people didn't really, and I think we also, and we being just wizards in general, just did a poor job of is saying, this isn't meant to be all of your characters and everything that you've been playing all along now live in this world, or you play through the spell plague and then you develop through this whole thing. It was, if you are playing 3rd edition or before, then keep using all the old stuff, right? But if you want to get into 4th edition, this is the Forgotten Realms that make sense with the 4th edition mechanics. They were meant to be completely separate. And that's where a lot of things got muddied up, because there's a very carefully crafted schedule for when the novels would release. It would sort of tell that story a little bit, the change story, the spell plague story. And then there would be a sort of hard restart, and now we're into that future timeline. But that never really developed well, as, just sort of schedules were changed, and there was a giant global economic depression too in the middle of that, which is kind of sort of the unknown thing that was thrown into the middle of that. That really, it was just sort of, if you could just sit down and think of what would be the worst possible time to tell the entire D&D community that everything you've ever bought is now just completely useless and zero, and you have to start over fresh from, right? That would have been it. It was, we need you to make a complete new buy-in altogether, completely different, while you either just got laid off or you're pretty sure you're about to be off. And that was like everybody, right? So there were some things that we could have done differently, and then there were some things that were sort of attacking us from the outside. And so suddenly, Borders went bankrupt. It was all this total, dislocation of everything around us. So we had to slow down the release of novels, which then made 4th edition Forgotten Realms seem like it was disaster world. Like there was this terrible thing happening, and that's all it was this kind of unfolding apocalypse, when that wasn't the intention. And if you look again at the 4th edition campaign setting, it was, this terrible thing happened in the past, and now this is what the world looks like. And the world is 4th edition compatible, right? And we're just assuming that all of your characters weren't even born then, and they don't know that it used to be a different way, and they're not all longing for, the pre-apocalyptic old days. It was just that sort of the most successful book series basically did that and said, oh no, we've lived through this this terrible catastrophe, and all of our friends are dead. How sad is that? which ended up just making 4th edition seem like disaster world. I don't know. Of all the regrets, I guess it was kind of, I regret that people never really had a chance to see how cool it was, but it shouldn't have happened at all. Right? We shouldn't have been in the position of having to completely break it and put it together again in a different form.
Just to kind of go back to a facsimile of what you had in 3.5 with 5e.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, then I was gone. I left in 2010. So I had no part of 5th edition at all, or that story that sort of tried to repair it. So I don't know. You live and learn, and then hope that, there isn't a depression somewhere in the middle of your best laid plans.
I can only imagine how having a depression ruins your release plans.
I think we weren't like probably the least of the damage that was done to to businesses around. Wizards of the Coast in general survived it, so I guess we can say success. Or it could have been worse. But that's something that I think everybody needs to kind of keep in mind in terms of 4th edition. That I believe you if you say you don't want to just trash your D&D campaign that maybe has been running. I mean, I have friends who are still playing in the D&D game that I played when I lived in Chicago, and I've been in Seattle for 22 years. To have people like that say, I don't want to just throw that away and start all over with 4th edition first level characters, I totally believe you. But for other people who said it seemed like it might be good, I just couldn't do it, I also understand that. Here's one thing to keep in mind, though, just as sort of as a pitch for 4th edition, which I never generally just don't bother doing. I think it is the best skirmish level miniatures rule set ever. Like, ever. And if it was sold maybe as chainmail or something else, just as a separate game, I think people would have just loved it. So in terms of a rule set for moving miniatures around, it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But as a role playing game, it's fun.
Yeah, I think at least for my part, I've tried to take a lot of, in hindsight, after I got over the initial irritation at the change in setting, like you were talking about. When I went back and looked at 4th edition, I found so many interesting, actual battle moves and things that make combat more engaging and fun that I've picked apart those and added them to my games years later. So I definitely can see where you're coming from with saying it's a really good miniature system.
Yeah. So if you still have all that stuff laying around, all the, the plastic minis that, came with it or that were released around the same time, and all those battle mats that were just brilliant, and you can see how it was to sort of set up almost like this great board game, and it really, really does work.
Yeah, I remember getting one of the supplement materials, the Creatures Vault, which is just pogs of tons and tons of monsters from their little Codex Bestiary, which is more like a codex for a tabletop game, for a war game.
Oh yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, I still use the pogs, and I have a bunch of the battle mats. They're great resources.
See, that's just, and a great artifact from the, they call it the Great Recession, but it sure felt like a depression to me. So of 2007, 8, 9, 10, that was an answer to, I can't afford these miniature, blind boxes of plastic miniatures. We got to give people sort of a cheaper alternative. When we've now, released a game that is so miniatures dependent, as opposed to kind of the earlier editions of D&D that would be like, if you have miniatures, that's really cool, and people started to expect that, but it wasn't necessary. 4th edition was pretty much a miniatures game.
Totally agree.
Just to sort of help people out, how can we do this cheaper, and then also how can we do this cheaper? But those are if they're still out there, and it's still fun, just kind of work your way through the shock to the system.
And a lot of the art from that period too, gorgeous. It really was kind of coming into this more visual mindset. The theater of the mind was no longer viable in 4th edition.
Mm-hmm.
You just could not play it. You had to have a mat and miniatures or pogs or meeples, just something.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I like the visual style of it too. I think it's a little bit brighter, where third edition everything was very, very dark, like literally dark tones to even the covers of the book. Everything felt very, not really monochromatic, but kind of, right? And fourth edition just really turned the lights on, and you sort of saw things in daylight rather than in that sort of gloomy space that third edition really felt like, to me anyway. Yeah.
I think if you go back and look at a lot of those books, their covers are very antique-ish, very directly. So even their internal spreads are very dated by now, but like designed to look old.
It definitely is interesting to see how that all kind of came together in the end. Now, during that period, you were senior managing editor for Wizards of the Coast, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that would be for the book publishing side.
How did that work for trying to correlate all of this new story from so many different people who were so used to the story being one thing prior? Where was everyone kind of apprised as to the changes that were going on in the setting, or was it kind of a, hey, remember this?
People were at different sort of periods in that transition. That we knew we had some authors who, or I knew that I had authors that I could go to and say, okay, so I need you to fill in this hole, right? That I need you to write, a trilogy, or at least a book that moves us from this is what third edition or all the previous editions of Forgotten Realms looked like, and now you're going to tell the story of why it looks like this in the future. And unfortunately, again, not all of those managed to get started, but some of them did. But again, because they all slowed down, it started to look like Forgotten Realms is the disaster world. But those were authors like Rich Baker and Thomas Reed, and definitely R.A. Salvatore as well, were all brought in to say, here's how we're going to kind of move this forward, and what part of that story you're going to tell, and then another part of the story somebody else is going to tell another part of the story. They will transition from third to fourth. It was just an awful lot of juggling, basically. It was a lot of, just me trying to map out what's really necessary to tell. And then making sure also that authors had their own space to, that I didn't send them outlines or anything like that. Just things that were like sort of focus in on that and not the other thing.
This brings up an interesting point. How was the process for kind of managing the setting through novelizations, for keeping this shared setting simultaneously shared but consistent?
It was actually pretty complicated when I first started there. So I started in 95, which was, sort of deep into the second edition period, when Forgotten Realms in particular had just become so hyper detailed and was still in the process of those gigantic box sets that were full of so much information. And if you remember from that period, there would be, 2 or 3 booklets inside that were just in tiny little type and so much information. Practically every building in Waterdeep was detailed down to the nth degree, and the relationships between all those characters and so on. So there was just this mountain of information. And, ultimately, and a couple years later, when I first started, there was no line editor on the book side for Worlds. We were all just kind of being assigned to things. So I was working on Birthright was a thing at the time. I worked on a couple of Dragonlance books, so I was just which was great. I enjoyed the being all over the map. I love the Planescape books. There's one that I think people need to rediscover. There were only 4 Planescape novels, all just brilliant beyond belief. Really, really spectacularly great fantasy novels, regardless of how you felt about, the game setting. But so that was really cool. But then when we came out to be part of Wizards and things got really reorganized, I applaud the decision at that point to really have line editors who would say, this is going to be, you go do this thing. You do the Forgotten Realms, you do Dragonlance, etc. And I think that really worked better. And I think we really were able to really re-energized things, not just because of the third edition rule set and kind of getting people back into D&D in general, but we were really able to concentrate on getting the right authors and to tell the right stories, and working to make those fit together in really interesting ways. I had a really good working relationship with the core RPG team for the Forgotten Realms, Stephen Shend and Julia Martin in particular at that time. And, we just talked to each other in ways that we didn't used to at TSR. And so we're able to engineer things which what we started to call non-changing changes, which were sort of the big stories that would have great, huge implications on the world, but not for a long time. So, that was sort of things like the threat from the sea and the Year of Rogue Dragons and Return of the Archwizards that were adding new bad guys, changing something about changed the nature of dragons in the realms. And then we would assume that if you're still playing this and your timeline is going 100 years, the world will look a little different, or, at least that part of the world will look very different. But it isn't sort of, hey, they just released a novel that made your entire D&D game moot. And what was kind of interesting in 4th edition, we were able to pick up some of those threads and then see them and kind of come to fruition.
You got to kind of bring it full circle and make use of what you put down beforehand. I guess that is a bright side to the time jump.
It was, yeah. And, but that was the era where there was always kind of a big story going. The War of the Spider Queen was one of those for sure. And then that also kind of gave us freedom to just tell all sorts of little stories within. And then it was just making sure that people weren't stepping on each other's toes. And the Forgotten Realms being geographically pretty big, it was pretty easy to say, well, yeah, all these Salvatore books are really awesome, but he never really leaves this kind of northwest corner of the map. And so whatever Drizzt is doing, whatever great adventure he's having, people in Cormier just have no idea and don't care. And they've never even heard of him. So a completely different story can be happening over there. And, like that whole, the death of King Azun and all that big thread that went through simultaneous to what everybody else was doing. And it just wasn't necessarily even mentioned. They didn't even know what was going on or care in Icewind Dale or in Fae or wherever. So it was just, basically me just trying to system manage, keep people from interfering with each other.
Keeping everything a little compartmentalized, like go over here with this book and you stay over there with that book and no one go up northwest because that's Drizzt land. And
Right. And then, it was just sort of, okay, listen, I know the Drow are cool, but we kind of got that covered, and so you're going to have to find your own stakes in here. And what's great about Forgotten Realms is that because, it became the sort of default D&D setting, and there was some weird old political stuff in the company when it was taken over from Gary Gygax, and the new ownership wanted to get rid of Greyhawk just kind of to spite him, and bought Forgotten Realms from Ed Greenwood and said, well, we're just going to replace Greyhawk with this new thing. But it was then designed, once it became part of the TSR, family of brands, it was the world in which everything from D&D existed. So it was every spell from the Player's Handbook is there, every race, every class, etc. So it became this giant, and it sounds negative to call it a dumping ground, but that's kind of what it was. It was every conceivable fantasy concept had to find a home in there.
The kitchen sink. It
was all of it. And so there was this tremendous freedom to say, what kind of story do you want to write? You want to write about undead? We got undead. You want to write Kingdom of Evil Magic Users? We got that, And then it also allowed authors to be able to go in there and say, I have a sort of obvious set of rules. I'm not going to blow up the world. I'm not, do anything, some sort of major catastrophe, any kind of global catastrophe. But nobody else is going to write about what happens in this city. So my thief character or whatever can do whatever he wants. And it really worked just by keeping Forgotten Realms what I call high fantasy, or my definition of high fantasy, which is I have to save the kingdom, as opposed to epic fantasy, which is I have to save the world, or sword and sorcery, which is I have to save myself.
That's actually a very interesting way to separate them, and it's so easy. I actually have not heard the definition of that before, and that works perfect in my opinion.
And because that's the thing that I think I always used to struggle with. What is the difference between high fantasy and epic fantasy, or is the two names for the same thing? Because it's the same amount of giant, detailed world building. And I would honestly put the Forgotten Realms world up against Lord of the Rings in terms of just internal detail and history. And it was a group effort, right, as opposed to one single author. But it's enormously rich. So then but then the stories that are told are generally very contained and not like Dragonlance, right, which was the D&D epic fantasy world.
That one was definitely peddled for a while as the D&D setting, and iconic D&D kind of takes a lot of its tropes from that. I know that at TSR, they tried to run with Birthright for a while, and now there's finally another person I've met who knows what Birthright is before I talk about it. And while that one I found interesting, I think the problem that it has, Dragonlance had, where it's too character focused. Whereas in Forgotten Realms, you have Elminster and you have Drist, but they're just characters who live in the world. They're just people in the world. They might be heroes, but they live in the world and it isn't about them. And I think that was probably the main appeal as to why, sure, it kind of was like the dumping ground, as you said, but I think it also had this massive scope where it was, you can tell any story anywhere. Like you mentioned, that thief can do whatever he wants in that city because no one's going to write about it.
Right. And that's the thing. It was a giant, expansive world that had no story to it. It wasn't, it wasn't sort of the setting in which we go find the One Ring, or the Dragonland. It was just a place. And in the same way that really I think the real world is just a place. And there's no limit to the number of mystery stories and romance stories and so on that you can tell here. That was sort of the goal of the Forgotten Realms, was to make this an open world where everyone can come in and, kind of stake their little claim. But it's never going to be much more than, sort of at arm's length.
I know that for my own setting and my own work, I definitely try to take that bent a little bit more of creating a world where any number of endless things can happen. And I think it's too much exposure to Forgotten Realms.
Well, see, that can cause some damage, because I work, with an awful lot of fantasy authors as now a freelance editor. And that's sort of the caution that I give everybody, is don't over world build, which is the sort of the first rookie mistake of the fantasy author, which is, I have to sit down and I have to get as much on paper as Tolkien did. And, there's me as this little squeaky voice in the distance saying, no, don't. You don't have to create every little detail of the world first to start writing a story. Let the story tell you what part of the world needs to be created. And then you do have the freedom to have some new idea or better idea as you go along, or for book 2, book 3, book 4, etc. Because you haven't then cemented everything in place the way it became very much cemented in place during that, I guess the sort of second edition phase of the Forgotten Realms, where so much was known about, going way back into, ancient history there. that's a kind of, and again, that's like, I think is the big disconnect between I'm writing a novel or, short stories and I'm creating some kind of open world game that, especially if you're thinking, I want to release this. I want this to be some kind of D20 thing or your own RPG that you want to then give to people and say, here, go play in this world. You do have to start creating stuff that isn't necessarily story focused.
Yeah, you have to kind of create more of these like sites of interest, places and areas that people want to go see, even if it's just a little marker on the rock that is like the stone of the Lich God. And it's what is that? It's just a giant stone, and you create a little bit about it that makes people want to go there.
And hopefully take it from there.
Yeah. Exactly. And maybe leave a little bit of mystery for the DM to decide. I know Paizo does this a lot in their world for Galarian. And they have so many things left open-ended just so that way you have this freedom to make some big decisions in the Galarian that you run. And I know there's tons of that in Forgotten Realms as well. It's amazing to see it. And I think a lot of the settings I've read that were third party, made by people who aren't one of the major publishers, they're too closed-ended. Like there isn't just enough wonder and mystery in them to just let people run free.
And I think, and again, I think that is something that if you are sitting down to write a fantasy novel, you don't want it to be closed-ended, right? But at the same time, you want to avoid any sort of giant info dump section, or even really a small info dump section where it's, I don't think you're going to understand what's going on here until I give you the full history of, which then your story comes to a complete stop, as opposed to, in something that is, here is literally the campaign setting or the world book that tells you everything you need to know to set an RPG game in here. You do kind of have to, well, if it ever comes up, this is this is exactly how the political system works. Here's, a count who hates this duke, and here's why, and now go and spin that out however you want. Otherwise, I think you do want to listen to what is your story and what are your characters telling you they need to have built around them, and then build it. Don't try to think of everything ahead of time.
Kind of just let it all come together when you're making it. Not worry.
And then, then it's the editing process that becomes more difficult. Then you have to try to figure out, and not try to figure out how to make it all work together, but make sure that it does all work together in the end. But, ultimately, what do your readers need to know right now to move the story forward? And that's how much world building you need in any given moment. And and then of course write that down so that the rules don't change somewhere midway through, which is where you're going to dump everybody out of the story.
Yeah, no, I think recalling back to reading some of the Dragonlance adventures for actual D&D play, and it's like they want you to copy exactly what they did in the books, exactly how they did it, surrender here to these things and all this other ways. And it kind of ruined it. And it's players don't want to copy what they did in the books. They want to copy the excitement of the books, not the events.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A really great story ultimately depends on a really great ending. And a really great RPG adventure really depends on no ending at all. Right? So it's all about the setup, right? This is the bad guy. This is what the bad guy's trying to do. This is where it's happening, right? Here's the dungeon full of monsters and everything. And then you get to the end of this in whatever way you can. If the more you put that adventure on rails, the less interesting it is. So that you have to do this here, you have to do that there. Well, you've made the wrong choice, so we're going to just make you do it again over and over again. Right? Like those sort of endless quest books. It's like, you go ahead and keep making decisions, but ultimately we're going to, get you to something like the happy ending or the heroic. We're not just going to go, well, you're dead and everyone in your family has been murdered. Way to go, stupid. there was really never that ending option. But in, at least back in the old school D&D days, that was definitely an option.
My players are way too familiar with that option.
Well, you missed every secret door and you're all dead morons. Or you survived, but the liches destroyed the city while you're in there. And that's what makes a role-playing game a role-playing game. But obviously a story, a novel or short story has to come to an end that everybody's like, that was cool and unexpected and interesting.
So I actually have a question. If you recall from the novels for D&D, did any of them end with a TPK? As common as it is for players to face that, did the novels ever reflect it?
No, I can't think of one that did. There were some that ended pretty unhappily. That not everything was, the sort of Steven Spielberg ending. Like, yay, and it's okay because we won World War II. That Saving Private Ryan framing story that's like, it's okay. It's all going to work out fine in the end. He's going to have like really pretty grandchildren. So there were some that were pretty bleak. I mean, at this point, it's been so long that I won't worry too much about spoilers, but I think the end of War of the Spider Queen was pretty dark.
Yeah.
It wasn't that everybody died necessarily, but essentially the reveal was this was all about who's the worst of these people and the worst person wins. Because that was the whole idea. Like, these are people who are serving a chaotic evil demon goddess, and the reward is to become her. And so the winner is the worst person here. And that was only later on. That was in the sort of post-TSR era, after we got out to Wizards of the Coast and could shed the comics code, or the TSR code of ethics, that we were able to start to get into darker territory, into sort of more grown-up storytelling. But as opposed to just sort of, that kind of, the first Evil Dead movie, like, okay, they're all, the last guy gets killed, the end. I don't think we ever really went there. That would be kind of mean to the author, but he was, well, I wanted, this to become a big series, like, Dritz. So we don't want to kill everybody. Give them a chance.
I think personally, and this might be different for Chris and Rag, but I know that for me, my favorite stories were always the short stories. One that I'll never forget is the last Mythal series of short stories, the Realm of the Elves, the last one. Yep. And it's Traitors, the one where the King Killer Star gets started and killing the golden dragons, and just all of it. It was awesome, and I just remember reading it, attending my brother's graduation from boot camp, and just loving that more than the Georgia Heat.
When I first started at TSR, it was was a regular thing that there was every year there was an anthology. It was the sort of part of the schedule that was made every year. And then this is going to sound really weird and awful, but once we got out to Wizards and people started to like do math and run it as a business, which was, trust me, it was a huge change for a lot of people coming from Wisconsin who were just sort of like, we think this is going to be cool, and just did it. It was harder for me to keep those on the schedule, but I fought to keep those all the time. And finally, they started to become tied into those big stories. So there was that, sort of every year there was the big story like Threat from the Sea, and then the Realms of the Deep was the anthology that came along with that. And Realms of the Elves was exactly that. Realms of the Dragons, which there were actually two of those because I bought too many stories. I just went on I like all of these sort of spree, and so we ended up with two of those. But there was always somebody on the business side going, these don't sell as well. It's like, I know, but they're cool. Like, they're cool. Let me do it. What the hell?
Maybe if Wizards had adapted early to ebooks, maybe it could have continued.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? I think they, the business started changing in ways that I think there were people there who kind of weren't ready for it.
I think too, those short stories, at least from my experience, so like when I was reading the longer ones, like the War of the Spider Queen, those ones were just excellent stories for me to enjoy as a reader. Whereas the shorter stories in the anthologies, I still enjoyed them as a reader, but they provided so much more inspiration in terms of my ideas for stories for adventures. And so if they had went that way, I think that could have been, because I mean, I know they did publish some adventures, but they weren't as prolific as I think they could have been, and those were really helpful in a lot of my D&D days.
Yeah, and that was another thing that became, was sort of another one of those business decisions that sort of were added later, which was that when I first started playing D&D, those adventure mods were gold. I needed to have those, even though everybody, so everybody had all the giant and all the descent modules and stuff. So it was really hard to actually run them. But this was how you knew how to even do this at all. And so I've always just had a great love of an adventure module. And those were also things that, on the business side, they kept saying, well, these sell like way less than the big source books. And, because if there's a D&D group and there's 5 players and 1 DM, the DM buys it. The other 5 players are not allowed to buy it,
Yeah.
So that's that'll stop you right there. But it's a key component to it. I think it was good that Dungeon Magazine came along to try to fill that, though, and say, there has to be a way to keep getting adventure material out there.
And Dungeon was very cool. Did you ever end up writing anything for it just by chance?
I did one. So I wrote an article in Dragon in the same month or right around the same time, the short adventure in Dungeon for Greyhawk 2000, which was the campaign setting that almost was. And that was just an idea that I had. I was freelancing before I started at TSR. And I pitched that as an idea to Jim Ward, who was in charge of the RPG side back then. And basically it was, what if the world of Greyhawk advanced technologically the same way we did? And the sort of current year in Greyhawk was 10 something. And so I thought, well, the millennium is coming up eventually, in like 8 years from now or whatever, 5 years. What if we saw Greyhawk in their year 2000? So it was kind of Shadowrun-ish, but rather than, the real world with magic, it was the magic world with real.
Actually,
and
interesting.
I guess he really liked the pitch, and he was kind of like, I had heard this as a rumor, I don't know, but he said, we need to hire this guy so that we can have this. And Rob King had left his position as an editor on the books team right just coincidentally at the same time. And Brian Thompson, who was running the book lines then, said, well, I have this opening, I'll at least interview the. So I think I kind of got that job because they wanted to secure Greyhawk 2000, which makes me feel really good about that, except that and then we sort of started to talk about it as, I kind of floated it again, and we started talking about it as a D&D setting. Then they wanted it to be an alternity setting, if you remember alternity, which I know is kind of coming back out, that Rich Baker and his guys are bringing it back out. But I kind of cringed at that a little bit because I thought that's the idea. It should be D&D. Like, this is the way we figure out how to bring computers and stuff into D&D. And we had some great brainstorming sessions, and even got Sam Wood did some amazing concept art, which I wish I could show to people because it was really super cool. And then it just died the death of corporate America. It died of lethal exposure to corporate America.
As too many great ideas before it had.
You know, God knows what's left on the battlefield behind us all, right?
So what you're telling me is that there's room for this to come in now.
I don't know, right? Who knows? Because who owns Greyhawk anymore? I guess it's still Wizards of the Coast, but I don't know. I even still have a mock-up of a book that our art director put together. It's really cool. And I just sort of kept it as a souvenir, but that's about all it is. But that was the kind of stuff that, you know, I loved about working there, at least during that kind of heyday period when we first came out to Seattle and Peter Atkinson had sort of turned the money spigot back on, and, you know, it really kind of got us out of the doldrums that we were in. And there was just a lot of ideas floating around. You know, this would be like, and I'm sitting there like, wow, this is my job. Like, this, they put me in this conference room and we're like brainstorming world building ideas for Greyhawk 2000. And like, I'm not going to get in trouble when I go back to my desk. This is like what I actually do here. That was a pretty cool way to spend 15 years of your life. It's hard to not look back on that and go like, that was awesome. Because it was also in that best period of time was really super collaborative. It wasn't, you know, I'm siloed in and this is mine and I'm going to tell everyone. It was, you know, there were teams of people working on this stuff.
It really was an awesome time as a consumer of D&D materials, just to have all this stuff constantly coming out. The world's always growing, and there's so much world building to be inspired by, and so many adventure threads and plot hooks to be made. And it was an awesome time that just hasn't really been recaptured, even by other companies, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, and it's great to see now from, you know, such a long distance from, you know, I haven't worked there in so long now, coming up on 10 years, that, you know, D&D is kind of back on this upswing. It's always, you know, having started playing it when it was this unknown weird something, you know. When I first started playing D&D, the first edition DM's Guide hadn't been released yet. So there were just sort of pieces of it in Dragon Magazine, previews of it. So from, you know, just as a player, as a fan, to watch this, you know, have this kind of first swell of success in the early 80s and then, you know, kind of fall off and then come back with third edition like crazy, then fall off again and then come back with fifth edition. It's cool to see that cycle on upswing again. It's like the game that wouldn't die, and it better not.
It always kind of comes back more popular than when it fell off.
And against all odds, too. Like, could anybody have predicted that in 2019 or now almost 2020, people are going to be sitting around playing, you know, pencil and paper RPGs? I think everybody just assumed, oh no, it's, you know, World of Warcraft has got this and it's never going to come back. But look at that. Amazing. Human interaction sometimes wins out.
Who would have guessed?
Impossible to predict. Those crazy humans.
That's it's so true too. I mean, even when you think about when 4E kind of crawled its way onto the market and into people's hearts, it kind of was their response to World of Warcraft and MMOs and video games becoming so popular. And they thought that this was the future. This is going to end it. And then they come back even more popular with 5th edition, which is just a mix between AD&D and 3rd edition, really. And it's impressive.
And I think that, you know, part of it is that there have always been fans in there, right? That the company has gone through various incarnations from, you know, the original Gary Gygax's TSR to the Lorraine Williams TSR, which is where I started. And then Peter Atkinson, who is just a fan. He started Wizards of the Coast with the goal to be the next Judges Guild. He was like, I want to just stuff. And, and so when the opportunity to buy the company came along, it was, we could not have had a better support. It wasn't some kind of corporate thing where it's like, well, I heard you guys have a crazy idea and maybe make some money off it. It was, I love this. I want you guys to do, have everything you need to do the best job you can. And it was just amazing. I will never see Peter Atkinson as anything other than the great hero.
The man who saved D&D.
Absolutely. And he really did, because it was, TSR was completely insolvent. He bought the company for the debt.
Oof.
He paid off the debt, and that's how he got it, which was a lot of money, too, by the way. And so we were all, would come into work and wonder if we were, going to have a job at the end of the day.
I definitely see Wizards of the Coast having a incredibly positive effect on D&D as tabletops as a whole. It just kind of has had this impression with 3rd edition, really with 3.5 and its popularity, and now 5th edition and all the things that it's done and continues to do. And I definitely think I'd like to see more stories return, but that's...
Yeah, that was too bad. I hated to sort of, watch that all disintegrate and, continue to hope it finds a home somewhere else. But, right? Everything seems to come around again. You never know.
Personally, like I used to love the Magic the Gathering stories. They're their card game property, and I loved the novelizations they had for those. You mentioned Rob King earlier, and his series of novels that he wrote for that were just informative on my youth. And then reading all the D&D books and then seeing that all kind of, like you said, disintegrate. It's like, yeah, there's an attempt now, but it's not what it was. And it's not that it's insulting. It's just disappointing, because you know what it was and what it could be.
Yeah, I don't know. I just would love to come and I'm always happy to have an opportunity to turn people on to Rob King. He writes under the name J. Robert King, and just one of the great underappreciated fantasy authors, I think, of all time. Honestly, if you can find his Planescape trilogy, it's going to be searching through used bookstores at this point. I don't know if that made it to the whole onto Audible or yet, or ever. But if you can find that Blood Wars trilogy by J. Robert King, just do yourself a favor. And not on a, sort of D&D level, but just as a spectacularly weird and very, very fantasy trilogy.
And all of his writing is kind of like that too, which is why he was perfect for Planescape. He wrote the Odyssey and Onslaught trilogies for Magic, and they're just strange and weird, and yet like it's things you never thought you could do with just high fantasy. Like you didn't think you could, and lo and behold, there it is, and it's awesome.
Yeah. He was really just trying. He was working to take it to a next level, right? At a time when, I first started with the company, the first thing they gave you was the code of ethics, which was incredibly stifling. And it was just sort of, how do we find a way to tell an interesting story around what was actually the 1950s comics code? And it was tough, but he found his way around it by getting so weird. There's kind of no way to interpret it. There was sort of, is this the bad guys winning? Because the bad guys can never be seen to be winning. It's like, I don't even know who the bad guy is. And it was just brilliant, just kind of working his way through that. I kind of ignoring it.
Yeah. I'm a little curious. The code of ethics for TSR, now, did that come about because of stipulation or regulation from the Satanic Panic?
Kind of, yeah. And again, that was just before I had started. There was, or sometime actually before I started there was this, it was sort of one of those perceived backlashes, right? That, and everybody's up in arms about this because clearly introduces your kids to the occult and it's got Satan written all over it and all that stuff. And, obviously and honestly, it was like two people just thought, ooh, here's somebody I can hassle. Like, here's a little bit of joy I can quash in the world, whatever it was. And then, maybe one set of parents who just thought, surely we can't have just missed every warning sign that our son was suicidal. So there's got to be somebody to blame, and if maybe it's this game he was playing, or maybe it was Ozzy Osbourne, it can't just be us, right? It can't just be him. So there was that. And that, I think everybody knows that second edition was an effort, take some of this, like we just won't use the word
all references to hell removed, devils removed.
And all of the assassins in the realms disappear all at once. Except for Artemis and Trary, by the way, because Bob Salvatore said, oh, he's not an assassin. He's a fighter thief who kills people for money.
Wait a minute.
Completely different. What are you talking about?
Absolutely no way to compare those two things. So, exception made for the biggest bestseller. But, it was, I remember just as a fan, as a gamer, ooh, second edition was coming out. We heard all this stuff. And then I was kind of flipping through it and going like, this is why? Like, why? That's a weird decision. Going to have this anymore? And it was just kind of, D&D edited. But then with THACO. I don't know. But yeah, that code of ethics then came in there too, right? Saying that, we think that these books are being read by kids. And this is obviously way, way before Harry Potter and sort of the rise of young adult and middle grade fantasy in the book section. So it was, we don't want Game of Thrones being read by innocent 8-year-olds. And then, of course, once we became part of Wizards, the first impulse out here was, well, that's stupid. Why do we do? Why do you even have that? That's dumb. We don't care about that. And then, of course, also the audience had aged by then too, so that our readership was really in their 20s and 30s. So things started to loosen up. Even then, I mean, there were still some rules you won't see. It's not exactly Game of Thrones, but it allowed for things like War of the Spider Queen, which was all about the bad guys, and the bad guys win. The bad guys existing in their own context. And strangely enough, it was always going to have a bizarre act of violence. Definitely just cut pieces off of people, but just don't show her boobies. So it was all it was all American in that way, sort of weirdly upside down. These people never have sex, but they murder each other just for no reason all the time. Like the first solution to any problem is violence, but don't touch each other.
It's an odd perception, very American thing where it
is.
I think George R. R. Martin said the best. You can graphically describe an axe going into someone's head, but any amount of nudity is unacceptable.
It is. And I will never understand it. Or, I got this job at TSR where I was just like, I'm going to work at TSR. Like, really? And so they said, this is the rule. So, I became the hatchet man. I mean, literally, editing out sentences and paragraphs of stuff saying nope, that doesn't pass. No, that doesn't pass. We talked about this kind of jokingly, but I wish we had actually done it, which was publish the unedited Ed Greenwood, because he was always the one we had to rein back in more than anyone. There was just always an excuse to just make somebody be naked. And then we had to figure out, can we just take out the word naked? And then we're to assume that she's wearing clothes? Yeah, let's just do that. All right. So it was just, now we're going to do the unedited Ed Greenwood.
I'd buy that compendium.
You know what? I think it would sell like crazy. But then it would still be like, well, this is super tame. I have HBO. What's the big deal? This is nothing. But, it was the world was going to come to an end if we left that in.
Oh, but of course.
Mm-hmm.
Feel pretty similar because I work with children and I run this huge D&D group for all of them, and it's been like going crazy with all the kids there. They're all roughly 10 years old, but I have to run edited versions, and even some of the other staff are like, I don't think you should be describing that bugbear's head being chopped off so viscerally to these children. And I'm like, they love it. Get over it.
And it, it does. It's odd that almost every RPG is sort of how you fight with each other and how do you kill somebody and what are the available weapons. And I think that there are some, I guess some parents certainly who are looking at this for younger kids and are thinking, like, what is this? I don't get what this is. And nobody really has done, I think, a good job of talking to parents about the difference between real violence and imaginary, and how good imaginary violence can actually be for kids that gives them a chance to sort of work through stuff and, rather than do it for real. I would definitely much rather have, when my kids were young, play Call of Duty than join the army. But that's me. I guess I'm just a big hippie at heart.
No, I think there's a lot of psychological research that backs up those claims.
Not to mention the other benefits of D&D for developing minds. Like, it helps with critical thinking, it helps with problem solving, it helps with teamwork and group work, and a host of other things that can go so far as even kind of helping them understand how to deal with certain issues in real life. And I think, even in therapy, they'll have you not roleplay D&D, but they'll have you come up with situations that upset you or whatever and work through them. And you can kind of mask that as a fun time.
No, I think all of them, I learned more from Traveler when I was in high school than I did from any teacher I ever had. I was a straight D math student. Like, I just, I would go to the classes and they would kind of explain it. And it seemed like, yeah, I think I myself on a test with no apparent outcome. Like, I'm just making these numbers into other, and I just couldn't get it. I didn't understand it. And then I started playing Traveler, doing their time formulas, how long they get from one planet to another, which was the square root of this over the other. And all of a sudden I'm just doing the algebra, and no one said, oh, you're doing algebra. Like, if they had, maybe I would have, but I could see what I was trying to get. And once I realized play this game, maybe that was I was just never really given the end result, right? This is what you're trying to figure out. Math for math's sake.
Math for math's sake. I personally hate it too, and then I go around doing probability problems for fucking magic decks.
I know, right? I remember I took physics when I was a senior in high school, and the teacher started to talk about vectors, and I was like, oh my God, wait, I know this. Like, this is the Traveler Starship Combat System. Like, I know this. Like for fun at home. And then, he was just like, what? And so I showed it to the teacher. I brought it in. He's like, this is amazing. Like, this is doing this. Yeah, we get it. We totally get it. It was insane.
That's fantastic. Traveler helping you pass physics. Awesome.
Where would I be without these games? I'm not sure we've talked a lot about work, but I don't know. I find this all fascinating.
Certainly been an interesting conversation nonetheless. Anyways, Rag, Chris, do you guys have anything you'd like to bring up?
I don't think so in terms of, I thought you did a great summary of both your career in the RPG space as well as the sort of trajectory and behind the scenes bits of 3rd edition, 4th edition, and that whole process, which for me was very illuminating and made me appreciate the setting a bit more. So
yeah, I think in cases like that, like an absence of information always leads to negative stuff. Like, they're not saying why they're doing this. We don't understand why they're doing this. So it must be that something evil must be happening, right? It must be they hate the fans and are, whatever. And, there's always this sense of, well, you can't say it. We don't want to say that. And we don't want to tell people. Just say what's happening.
Yeah. I never quite got to they're doing this because they hate us phase, but I do distinctly well, like when you were describing the delay, right, between the novels and when the fourth edition books came out, and they were like, "Oh, all that bad stuff happened a long time ago." I distinctly remember the experience of reading some of the novels where the characters were like surviving this experience and being like, "Wait, this doesn't make any sense. My wizard is going to survive this thing, and then his magic is totally different. What? This is so dumb."
Right? Is that what they tried to survive the spell plague? And it was just that was never the intention. And not to say that the intention was great, which was you're going to trash everything you've ever done in the start, but that was the marching orders we got, basically.
You'll have to excuse me if I'm outstepping my bounds, but you mentioned you had a concept art book for Greyhawk 2000.
I think I have somewhere. I have some of the things.
Would you be at all willing to share?
I wish I could, but those are all things that were created by an in-house artist, at Wizard. So I don't know. I mean, I suppose I could probably try to contact someone there and see if I could do it.
I think it's an actual crime that those don't get shared. Those sound awful.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. Just mentioning it, I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, I was just to say that those things are out there. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that I wish had happened. The whole Centipede reboot when we became part of Hasbro, that was so cool and just disappeared from one day to the next. There was a bunch of stuff that was really left on the table. I wish we'd sort of had a chance to see through, or that people had a chance to take a look at. But, who knows? And again, in the last 10 years since I've been there, I'm sure there's all sorts of stuff that didn't make it. And then there was, that open call for worlds for campaign settings that we did. And I was part of the committee who looked at all of those and, sort of decided on finalists. And there was some amazing stuff. That was what became Eberron. And there were some that were just like so cool and weird and different. Would have been really along the same lines, like the entire world is the dungeon was kind of what we mostly got. But in some cases, some of the people really came up with some bizarre and really interesting ideas. And, I don't know. Who knows what's going to float to the top, I guess.
So since you got to read all of these like fan submitted ones to have the next one, and you kind of had an idea, what is it that you think, or what is it that you were looking for in a RPG, specifically in its world building for publication?
Well, I think we didn't. What was really interesting, that in particular, never really sat and said, "This is what we want and this is what we don't want." But for me, what I was looking for in that particular context was, we have the epic fantasy setting, so we have Dragonland, which is, your characters basically real. Margaret and Tracy's characters save the world. We have Forgotten Realms as a high fantasy setting. And then we are kind of at a loss for what's the sword and sorcery, what's the I save myself kind of grittier, sort of old school pulp setting, which was Dark Sun, actually, I thought kind of fit that mold.
I can see that. That actually kind of fits, though it has the sword and sandals aesthetic, so I guess it kind of makes sense.
But then, at that point, that was kind of dead, And so that was the kind of thing that I was looking for, was where's something that, we're beyond the now. We don't, fantasy has evolved in so many ways, and in terms of the expectation, it's not just another sort of a rehash of Lord of the Rings. We want to see different things. So that's what really I was looking for, was what is the kind of, and I have this great love of pulp fiction, that old, that's kind of where I came into fantasy, through Robert E. Howard via Marvel Comics and, kind of that old school tradition. That was kind of what I was looking for, is where can I just be, not literally Conan, the Conan role-playing game, but that kind of tougher, less civilized world. Yeah.
Like a wandering, tough guy in a brutal world. And Eberron's what kind of came out from that.
It wasn't entirely up to me, right? Right? But at the same time, one of the things what got my vote for Eberron was that it was presented as that. But rather than this is, the Conan world, it was pitched really as, this is kind of the Sam Spade or Mickey Spillane world with fantasy. That was sort of the kind of the log line pitch, right? It was a civilized, kind of settled place where magic took the place of technology and worked with technology. And that, kind of the idea was you were kind of like a private detective, or that was that kind of an adventurer, as opposed to, I'm going to go off on this epic quest across the continent. It was more like, I'm going to solve mysteries and stuff.
Yeah, it has this like grittier feel to it, like a noir book, a swashbuckling tale, a desperado tale. And those are all viable things you can actually do in Eberron, which is awesome. And so I can kind of see it having that similarity to old sword and sorcery stuff of being kind of more personal, a little bit grittier, a little bit more low to the ground in terms of scope. So I personally think it lives up to that expectation. Do you think it lived up to the expectations you had when you selected it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, kind of it went through a development process that said, but, it still has to accommodate this from D&D, and we have to make, but I think that it retained that spirit of a uniqueness that we weren't seeing in a lot of the other settings or the other pitches that we're getting, which were, kind of variations on the medieval fantasy theme, right? I've drawn a map of, and here's how the kingdoms kind of relate to each other, which is exactly what Dragonlance is, and exactly what Forgotten Realms is, exactly what Greyhawk, so on. So, I think Eberron just sort of said, and then there's this whole other level to it, that we're realizing magic. And it's not just strictly medieval, which to me I thought was always fascinating, because I think once, and, certainly from a world building perspective, once magic becomes too pervasive, of course it's going to end up taking the place of technology. And that's kind of what magic in our world is, where, we invent our way out of stuff. And so if you can create a magic item that allows somebody to fly, or that will allow a machine that you've built to fly, you've invented the jet engine, basically. And why wouldn't it then take off in the same way? And pretty soon people will say, I want to be able to and do all this sort of other stuff. And I think that's exactly what Eberron was going to, which was, if I can power a train with magic, then I'm going to build that thing. Why wouldn't I build that thing? Everybody's going to want that.
Yeah, why wouldn't its form come into something a little bit more ease of use, mass use, than just like a wand or one wizard sitting there? People are going to want to fly en masse. They're going to want to transit en masse. It makes perfect sense.
And it is kind of hard then to keep, well, we all live in this kind of medieval world where everybody's a farmer and, right? But there's this whole layer of people who can do these miraculous things, but for some reason they kind of choose not to, or they keep it to themselves. Which is, I think, for anybody, any fantasy builder, that challenge is then, how is this limited in some ways so that not everybody can use it? Which was sort of that was kind of understood in D&D from the beginning, that you have to be a magic user to use this, that it's not just anyone can cast a spell, your fighter can't do it. It's not that he just sort of chose to do something else. It's just, he can't do it. So it's limited to only a certain number of people who are willing to, go down that path or have some kind of spark to them or something like that. And, that's kind of, you have to really make that decision. I think magic, like technology, is kind of all or nothing. You're either, it's out there and it's for sale, or it's controlled in some way.
That was always my, I suppose, my intimidation about trying to make any sort of modern setting that had a fantasy flair in it, specifically for like the reasons you were talking about of like, well, it should become mass produced, and then like, wouldn't all of technology seem or be really different? Like, why would I invent the airplane when I could invent like a factory for making these fly wands, right, and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then you have to think of everything.
Right. So, well, I mean, everybody just with a flying potion would be crashing into each other. But but even then, like, you could open a portal, right, or teleport people from here to there, and then but ultimately, it sort of serves the same purpose that you would, you now have a world that's more cosmopolitan. You have a world where people have actually seen this other city. They've actually been there. People from that other place have come to their city, etc. I think it definitely can be done. And I think also, if you look at technology, not everything is freely available to everybody. I mean, I buy tickets on airplanes. I don't have an airplane. And, even if I did, I'm going to be following strict rules about, what direction I'm flying in and how high I'm going, how fast I'm, so that I don't bump into somebody else's airplane and so on. So, is there some measure of control over it? There would have to be, otherwise you could see, if everybody was 7th level wizard, it would just be mass chaos, right? It would be so easy to steal from each other and, accidentally burn places down like that, it seems like there would have to be some control over it.
Yeah, it goes along with when you were saying it's an all or nothing type situation. I mean, to make the technology comparison you just did, you can use real world examples of like why certain regions aren't as up to like modern standards of technology as others. Constant war, natural disaster type situations, political situations where there's like a tyrant or some situation like that, and you can just transport those into your fantasy setting and be like, well, this isn't, or this is why every farmer doesn't just take one level of wizard after learning how to read to get create water the cantrip, because that would be incredibly useful.
Sure would be. Right. Or just, join the religion that allows you to create food and water and eliminate the middleman. Like, what's for dinner? I don't know. Let's pray something up. And that it's the sort of thing that, D&D as a game in particular, I guess let's blame it on Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, never really thought through all that stuff and thought, well, if people can do all these things, why are we living in society that this would help us to, just with greater crop yields and all of this kind of stuff. And I think what was great about the original conception of D&D was, we're not going to tell you that. That's up to you to decide that. There was an assumption in the original D&D rules that now you're going to go create a world for these things to exist in. So it was this much world building, right? We're going to tell you how magic works so that it's consistent throughout. And there's this difference between arcane and divine and so on. But then go put that someplace into some kind of context that makes sense. And that was really left for everybody to decide. And it got complicated, for instance, Forgotten, where, well, now you really have a lot of people here who are clearly using magic at a very high level, and they're just kind of deciding not to do stuff. And so in there are built-in adversaries, people who are actually trying to keep each other in check. And then ultimately, there was a sort of magic police force there, the Chosen, that would, kind of keep the weave together. And so there was a sense that there was a higher power kind of keeping magic in check to some degree. And those are the things that you got to kind of think through is, well, if anybody can do it, then everybody's going to be. So how do we limit that? Or let it go and see where that takes you.
Take you to the absolute chaos of regular everyday civilians throwing fireballs around the street during a riot.
Which could be fun. I mean, I would read that
fun.
book, right? I mean,
Hyper magical society going through a French Revolution. That actually sounds pretty awesome.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And there's like 500 gods, and they all just like show up. Like, hey, come and help me. And they do. Like, they're actually there. That's rough, right? That's kind of hard. But that's the sort of things that we talk about, in world building in general is, I think most of world building, I've said it before that 90% of world building is naming things.
I can agree to that.
And I kind of stand by that as a half joke, half serious. But if the other 10%, I think, is limiting things, it's, drawing circles around so that they don't get out of control. Yeah, and so you don't end up with a character like Superman, where it's like, how do I write a story for this indestructible guy who can do anything and can't be hurt by anything? There needs to be something at stake here. And it's limitations on people where.
So, within world building, where do you think the best place for someone who's new should start? We can keep this mostly to RPGs for simplicity's sake.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the great things about RPGs, right, is that once you say, we're going to sit down, we're going to play whatever, that gives you some big chunks of world building already in terms of how magic you are. So this is how you cast a spell. This is what the limits of that thing is, what it can and can't do, how it tells you a little bit about what powers they can grant to you and what you can kind of expect from them, which is to say, if you're first level, right? And then as you go up in levels, maybe you're getting some ability. So I think those are things that, and there are definitely a lot of authors keen into fantasy or RPGs in general that have kind of learned world building. It's like, how does magic work? What are the limits around things? What is the sort of, there's a game mechanics to it that is, you can use this will, has a of this many feet and, a duration of this many rounds. So it started people thinking, certainly started me thinking as a sort of young fantasy about the limitations of things, that it isn't just, I can kind of do anything I want with the snap of fingers. I've got this limited set of skills. So I think learning world building through RPGs, I think, is a great way to do it, because the game mechanic side of it forces you to think in terms of exactly what this can do. Yeah. So I'm just, I think it's really about, world building is about rules, and in role-playing games, those rules are literal. There's actual numbers attached to those. In fiction, you just have to convey it in action.
Like setting the limitations on your own setting are kind of one of the things that you should kind of understand first before you really dig into it, is what I got from what you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And again, I think it's entirely different or not entirely different. There are differences between approach to, I'm creating a D&D campaign setting, or I'm creating a setting for this story, a place for this character to live. But I think the commonality is about the limitations. Who can use it? When can you use it? How big is this monster? What does it eat? How tall is it? How strong is it? What weaknesses does it have? and then going, and then that's the next level. Again, the D&D doesn't necessarily, or the good sort of rule set doesn't necessarily do for you. But the campaign settings, and not just, I go back to Forgotten Realms because it's the world I lived in for the longest and worked on, in the most detail. But whatever that setting is, then gives you a sense of governments and how they work together or oppose each other. The difference between culture and government, right? The difference between religion and government, the effect that religion has on culture. And I think the campaign set, the D&D campaign setting, and then, the sort of RPG worlds that came after, both in the analog or pencil and paper and the digital or video game world, really brought something new and interesting to the world, the real world. Here is a book that describes an imaginary place, and that's all it does. So if you open up the Forgotten Realms campaign setting book from your choice of editions, you're getting an encyclopedia of an entirely created world, and that's all it is. It doesn't. It's not a really boring chapter of this novel. That's the whole thing, and all of the efforts were put into just building the world. And now you go tell a story in there. I don't know that people really kind of get that that's a very new and very unique and strange invention.
Yeah. That it's kind of this only last 30, 40 years that it's really kind of taken off. I mean, even early D&D was only starting to form it. And then then you have the explosion of settings, of course. It's kind of with that, I think, that reading a book that is just a fantastical created world, that's new. Like even reading like a fantasy novel, like reading like Lord of the Rings, it's not the same thing. And I think that's amazing. Personally, I'm glad that I get to live through the time of this thing, of this is hype.
Yeah. And it really is. It's all, and obviously role-playing games have been a major influence on my life. I mean, I just can't underestimate, the influence they've had. But, it's a thing that did not exist in any form, that just appeared as if by magic in a very unlikely place from very unlikely sources. Kind of high school dropout nerd in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And, and as a kid, I'd been to Lake Geneva in the summer on the kind of this little touristy town. A population of 5,000. This is just not a place that something like that is invented. I don't know. Right? Or I guess it is, right? It's just, and it without that, there would be, I think if you look around the massive multi-billion-dollar video game industry, where would that be without D&D? And how many of those games that have huge successes? Elder Scrolls is D&D, it's just D&D. Mass Effect is D&D or Traveler, it's the science fiction version of that. They're all kind of D&D. I mean, how much health you have is how many hit points you have. Everybody levels up. That's D&D.
Yeah. The impact it's astounding. You can't quantify how much it has changed, because it changed so much, especially in just hobbies in general.
Mm-hmm. And that there are just millions of people playing, especially these big video game franchises who will kind of don't get that. Well, this is kind of really all D&D with, a computer making some of the, rolling the dice for you, basically.
You don't notice you're rolling dice.
That can't be true. It's but it really is. And it just never occurred to them to patent that. So they just gave that gift to the world. And here is the role-playing game. I don't think that's ever going to happen again.
No. And thank God it did.
Right. Like when my mother, and when I was in high school, had said, boy, if you spend as much time on your homework as a good game, but I'd build a lifelong career on it. Not everybody was me, right? I didn't, I just decided, no, I'm doing this. Like, I'm not just going to be an accountant or something. I can't do it. I'm going to do some version of this. And, it was great to have the last laugh, but I'm not the only one. I mean, there's people out there working on, whatever video game, and then, one after another, you just see them come out all the time. Role-playing games now as D&D is on that upswing and bringing other people with it. It's become this massive thing. And global, too.
Yeah. There's people, and with the advent of virtual tabletop simulators like Roll20, where you can just go on the internet and play a game on the internet of D&D, you can play with people around the world, and it's amazing.
It's there. How about that?
Don't make me cry, guys.
I know.
It's too beautiful.
Thank you, Gary Gygax. And Dave Arneson, who doesn't get as much credit as he totally deserves. They're great American heroes.
True patriots.
They are. Thank you, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Why does that feel sad for some reason? When it's actually all good news. It's actually really great. Good for them. They created a thing that brought amazing things to the world.
And as legitimately enthralling as this has been, I think we'll let you talk a little bit about your world building course for Writer's Digest.
Oh, okay.
And please take the stage.
Yeah, so this is something that I do with Writer's Digest University that is starting up again on January 9th. And so you can go to, actually just find me on Twitter. It's at Phil Athans, PhiLAthans. And you will not fail to see me pimping this course, and just follow the link there. But it's 4 weeks and it's all online. Show up at a certain time. Don't worry about what time zone you're in. It's a global thing, which is great. There are, all these people from, scattered around the world who are part of each course. And for 4 weeks, we just dig into at least the big uber topics of not role-playing games, but role-playing games for sure, but of world building. And it is definitely open for gamers, authors, if you're working on screenplays or games, anything. And there's some assignments, so you just do an assignment every Sunday, send it, give you some feedback on that, and there's discussion boards where you can meet and trade stories and ideas with the other people in the class. And it's all done really easily through Writer's Digest University.
Does it cost anything?
It does.
Oh.
And to be honest, right off the top of my head, I don't know exactly how much, outside that, the hired from Writer's Digest, but follow those links in it, and you'll see all that. They'll give you all that. But
awesome.
I've been running this one for, I've even lost track of how many separate runs of this course have happened. It kind of comes up on a cycle. I've got a few other ones. I've got a pulp fiction workshop where we just write a 6,000 word short story, or everybody writes a 6,000 word short story over 4 weeks. And then 2 horror writing classes. But I love doing these. And this is actually one of the things that I've always loved about being an editor. At the same time, has always kind of caused me mixed feelings, which is you can publish so little of what you read, but so much of it is actually really great. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about, the open call for campaign settings that ended up with Eberron. I think it was Norman Spinrad who said that 80% of anything is crap. And I disagree with him. I think 10% is crap, 10% is great, and 80% is actually really. So for me, I love these courses. I get to see some really great stuff from talented people that just come from all over the place.
So January 9th on Writer's Digest, you can take the world building course with Phil Athans. Thank you for coming on, Phil. It was honestly amazing. I loved hearing every second of this, and I'm floored by how awesome this was because I thought it was going to be great. It even surmounted that. I got to hear WotC lore I had never heard before. Get to talk about the actual dark side of the editing room and so much more. Oh, and once again, someone else who knows about Birthright.
It was my time there was 99% fantastic, and the 1%, you live and learn. But thank you for having me. It's really been fun to just chat about stuff.
And you're most certainly welcome back. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Great.
And thank you all for listening. Have a great night. You've been tuned into Worldcasting, an affiliate production of Worldbuilding Magazine. Have any feedback, comments, questions, or concerns? You can get in touch with us on our website, worldbuildingmagazine.com. There you can find links to our social media, or feel free to come chat with us on the Worldbuilding Magazine Discord server. Thanks for listening to Worldcasting, and until next week, keep world building.